All right, I think we're live on air. I just would like to have a confirmation from my colleagues in Budapest that everything works fine. If Agi, you could let me know, that would be super helpful. A warm welcome to everyone who's joining us today at the live version of the Lawyer-Linguists EPSO exams, the 2023. Today is the 18th of September, though you might be watching this as a recording later on, but those who are here at the live edition have certainly the benefit of asking questions, and I'll do my very best to answer those as we go along. So sound is good, everything is fine, that's wonderful. So thank you so much for being here, perhaps in your lunch break, depending on when you're located, to cover the new edition or the new version of these Lawyer-Linguists exams. And I say new version because in 2023, as many of you would know, EPSO has changed the way they select future EU officials and the way they create the reserve list based on which you will be recruited, you will be hired as an EU official. So that is something we're going to cover extensively, and I'll share with you all the insights, all the ideas that I have in this regard. So with that, why don't you type into the chat box, as we traditionally do, where you're dialing in from, where are you joining us from. So put that in the chat box. You'll get familiar with asking questions and using that to put any question that's on your mind throughout the next hour or so. All right, we have Josefina from Portugal, wonderful. Luxembourg. So those from Luxembourg are presumably around the EU institutions already. That's very good. Slovakia, and probably far more away also from Brussels. So to be sure, you presumably hear me fine. You can see me, the video feed, and the technology works as it should. So with that, you might know my background. I've been dealing with EU careers, with EU affairs for quite some time. I had to recently update the photo because the time shows that we've been in this field for over 15 years. And that hopefully gives me a certain perspective that I can share with you and you can benefit from to take the most advantage of the preparation tools and the resources we give you to increase your chances of success and to be sure that you pass the competition. About our company, very briefly, EU Training boasts a really robust community of those interested in EU careers. And many of our clients are actually EU officials, one way or another, because they might be contract agents, temporary agents, even though some are actually fully fledged EU officials, but they want to jump a grade or they want to pass an internal competition, hence their interest in the services that we offer, hence their interest in furthering their EU career. You might want to join one of our Facebook groups or Facebook communities. It's, again, a pretty robust community. If you're on that platform, make sure to check it out. And then we are increasingly investing and looking at LinkedIn to improve our presence there. We're trying to put there more information and more resources and more insights. So that's another platform where you might want to follow us. The question database is an ever-increasing pool of useful resources, not just abstract verbal numerical reasoning tests, but many other things beyond that. And a lot of them have been used, an impressive number in different test combinations. And then certainly check out the webinars. This kind of information webcast is something that we do on a regular basis for every upcoming competition. But we also have a great number of methodology webinars and similar recordings that you can watch, that you can learn from, and then improve your performance. So with that, why don't we actually get to the main topic of today's discussion, which is the Lawyer-Linguist competitions. A few words about the new selection process before we get into the very specifics of this particular competition. So a couple of points there. The new system is not radically different from the old system, though it has certain changes and a more streamlined process aiming at a quicker, faster selection. So the idea now is that from application all the way to the reserve list, it shouldn't take more than 6 months, which again, in EU terms, is a quick and fast procedure, as opposed to the previous one, some of which is still being phased out because there are ongoing competitions that are being concluded as we speak. Those may have taken a year and a half, even longer because of COVID. That is not to be followed in EPSO's new mindset, but they really would like to make it quicker and more efficient to be sure that they can hire you at the end of the process much faster. Certainly, everything starts with an application. We're going to look at it, what it means, how it may have slightly changed or not radically. And that is followed by you needing to provide supporting documents. Now, the interesting thing is we're going to point out is these two deadlines are decoupled. They are not at the same time that you need to finish your application and provide all the supporting documents. So you can actually provide those supporting documents a little later, even after the application deadline, because you may need to get certain translations, you may need to get some official certificates or other supporting documents. So they give you a little more leeway as to obtain those specific documents. Number 3, automated and remotely proctored test. So that is the, let's say, on a procedural level, a novelty, because every EPSO competition going forward is going to be remotely administered. So you can be anywhere in the world and take these tests. And the term remotely proctored, that means that there is not going to be humans on the other side of the screen, so to say, who are going to check whether you comply with all the technical and legal requirements of taking a particular exam at that point. So that essentially means that you will be computer supervised. So it's going to be an algorithm and different technical checks that are going to make sure that you don't have any other person in the room. There is no cheating during the test, the actual exam taking. So all of that is going to be remotely and automatically proctored tests. There's no more test centers. There's no more, again, humans who will be sitting on the other side of the screen when you take a particular exam. Having said that, a quick advertisement here. The very space where I'm doing this from, this is available for rent. So if you happen to be in Brussels and you're looking for a place where you want to take the test, we have this silent and technologically reliable place where you can see the test. We charge a small fee for that. And you get a smile, you get a bit of encouragement to be sure that you can focus on the exam and not on the other stuff around it. Now, having said that, all new competitions, and by the term new, I mean those competitions that have been and will be launched after summer 2023, so ever since this reform system has come into effect. So all these new exams have a certain variation of components. So there could be different exams as part of the test-taking day and the procedure, but by and large, there's not a huge variation. So there's a relatively small number or small number of tests that EPSO or the selection board of a given competition may pick, and those are the ones that you need to sit. So obviously today for lawyer-linguists, we're going to focus on the ones that you as future lawyer-linguists need to take. But this is just to highlight that if you happen to take another EPSO competition because your profile fits that particular competition, you may encounter a different combination of tests than the one or the ones that I'm going to discuss today. Then there is an eligibility check, which again, in the spirit of streamlining the process, EPSO would, or the selection board more specifically, would do later in the process. So you apply, you provide the supporting documents, you sit the test, but the eligibility, where they check the truthfulness, the authenticity, the relevance of certain documents, that usually happens towards the end of the selection procedure. So you may pass all those steps and yet get an uncomfortable feedback or news saying, hey, we checked your document and we didn't find that it fits the criteria. Therefore, you may not be eligible to be placed on the reserve list, that unfortunate news may happen, and that might happen in the end if one of your supporting documents does not meet the criteria. So that is to say, hopefully everything goes well. You have provided all the right documents and everything meets the right standards. And then comes the reserve list. Reserve list basically means that you are recruitable. So in practice, it means that you can be hired by any EU institution when there is a specific vacancy for a specific job. In this particular case for lawyer-linguists, that practically means the European Court of Justice and the lawyer-linguist or the linguistic department, the translation department, where lawyer-linguists would be hired for this particular competition. So the reserve list is a necessary but insufficient criterion. And I say insufficient because a head of unit in a linguistic unit can call upon you once you're on the reserve list and say, hey, come in for an interview or come in for a conversation whether you really meet the profile or the kind of person that we'd like to hire, and then they can choose whether or not to actually extend a job offer, right? So there is that part which is no longer part of the selection procedure. It's the recruitment part, but then again, you meet all the criteria that the institutions formally require, and they have selected you because you passed the different steps of the competition and placed on the reserve list. And that is the point when the actual hiring might require an additional step. And in this case, that might be an interview, that might be nothing, because legally speaking, a head of unit can perfectly and fully in line with all the provisions of the hiring process, they can just pick your name from the reserve list and say, here's a job offer. So they can absolutely do that, but they might want to have an interview or a phone conversation or something along those lines, which is not something we know right now. And it's not something that may be uniform across the different languages or even across the Court of Justice as an institution either. So this is just to flag it that there might be some interview and extra step there, but we're focusing on the selection procedure right now to the point where you get on the reserve list. And then again, for lawyer-linguists, it's slightly different because it's a very targeted, very specific kind of job. Especially, it even focuses on languages. So one particular language profile that we will look at in a moment. So it's very, very targeted. And therefore, these kind of extra steps are probably not going to happen, or even if they do, it's more really just a formality. Whereas for other competitions, which are far broader and the number of applicants is higher or the profile is more diverse, then that extra step may carry a bit more weight. So having said that, lawyer-linguist competition overview, and then again, full disclaimer, I used to be a lawyer-linguist. I actually passed almost the same, though again, with the caveat that the system has slightly been adapted and changed, but a very similar kind of competition. Well, more years ago than I care to remember, but it was almost like 2 decades ago. Yet that experience, and then I actually was on a selection board many, many years ago for other lawyer-linguists. So I'm happy to share my insight from the time. And again, the system has slightly changed since, but certain dynamics and the general approach is broadly the same. So having said that, which or what kind of positions are available and how many? Now, being on this webinar or listening to this, you're certainly aware that there are different linguistic profiles, and each has a certain reference number for Spanish, for Lithuanian, for Dutch, for Portuguese, for Slovak, for English. And an important point to emphasize, and we're going to look at the languages and how or what the rules are around languages. But one very important point is the language is decoupled from your passport, right? Like there is no direct connection between you holding a certain passport, as long as it's one of the EU 27's passport, and the language that you choose. So me as Hungarian, I could choose English, provided I meet the criteria, and the criteria being at what level is my especially written English, and do I pass the competition? Now, again, what they require for these languages is that you're pretty much not just fluent, but mother tongue level, so almost native or de facto native level. So that's not easy to reach, but again, it's not necessarily the same as your passport, because there's a lot of different there are many different life paths that may have led you to this point. And maybe you have one passport, but then you grew up in another country, and essentially that's the language that is essentially your mother tongue. And again, your family situation and other variables. How many candidates are sought? Well, the numbers are not huge, and yet it's still a very niche kind of competition, right? Lawyer linguist, you need to meet certain criteria. There are a lot of linguistic criteria, something that we're going to look at in a moment. So the number of candidates, it's the number of applicants, is probably going to be more limited. So the question is always about the proportions. How many places are there on the reserve list, and how many applicants are there? If you have the luxury to choose from 2 options, perhaps even more, because you speak those languages at the sufficient or at the required level, well, then you can do a bit of odds calculation and say, well, it seems that there are a lot of English language lawyer linguists that are sought, or perhaps Portuguese with 25, then you can go for that. So if you have that flexibility, you might give it some consideration. But then again, be sure that you have a real chance of passing the competition, because that should be your primary consideration. And only then might you want to think about calculating the odds and doing that sort of choice. So with that, what are you going to work? Well, it's already known at this point that whoever is hired in the end will be working in the wonderful city and country of Luxembourg, because the job is to work as a lawyer linguist at the European Court of Justice. So that is already known. Legally speaking, you could be hired even at the council, and you could even be hired at the parliament and the commission, for that matter, as lawyer linguists. But this is not something that the institutions would want to do, especially not as a result of this particular competition or this particular reserve list. So again, legally speaking, once you're on a reserve list, you could be hired by another institution as well. But given the, let's say, the sometimes written, sometimes tacit agreement between the institutions, they're not going to poach candidates from a reserve list that was meant for a particular EU institution. In a nutshell, you are going to be hired by the European Court of Justice. And that's a whole other question, whether once you are hired, could you actually move or get a transfer to another position, another job inside the Court of Justice or other institutions like the Court of Auditors or Commission or any other EU institution. Again, that's another matter. It doesn't concern us today for the purposes of today's conversation when we talk about the selection procedure. But again, it's a side note. If anyone is interested in that, I can share certain insights. And the bottom line is, usually you would need to stay for 3 years in a given job before you could apply for another position inside the institution or being transferred to another EU institution while keeping your grade intact and keeping your salary intact. So with that, what are you going to do? Well, a lawyer linguist is both a lawyer and a linguist. Well, surprise there, right? It's pretty self-explanatory. But then again, what the job actually entails may not be full common knowledge. Some of you may already be working in similar posts. Those who commented you are in Luxembourg, you might be doing linguistic jobs or translator jobs. But a lawyer linguist sometimes does pretty mixed kind of work, because it could be translation, so translating judgments from the Court of Justice, General Court, opinion from the Advocate General, written pleading. So legal documents in the context of the European judicial system from a source language into your language one. And that is why your language one needs to be almost impeccable, especially in writing, because that's the target language into which you will be required to translate texts. But it's not only translations, sometimes it's reviewing translations, and sometimes it's proofreading, and sometimes it's even providing some legal analysis. If you are asked, based on your knowledge of certain legal systems and knowledge of the EU's legal system, and perhaps national legal system, which again, it may or may not be fully linked to a given language, because if you take English, well, the UK is no longer an EU member state. So the British legal system is less relevant for this kind of job today. But again, speaking English might give you certain insights to other language or linguistic systems if ever you are called upon to say, well, can you give some expertise? Can you give some opinion on that particular legal matter? But for other languages, say Lithuanian, now there might be question about the Lithuanian law in the context of some proceedings or some judgments or some preparatory materials. But the bottom line, and really the core of the job, is to translate, is to review, is to proofread legal texts, and to be sure that you are fully accurate with the terminology, you are fully accurate in style, that you are really able to turn the French source language and the source text into fully accurate text in the target language, which is one of those languages that we have just shown in one of the previous slides. So that's pretty much the job. And there's a big question, are you eligible? So what are the formal, or let's say the objective selection criteria, and what are the specific, or I wouldn't use subjective, but the more specific selection criteria, largely based on your linguistic knowledge and largely based on the results of the competition, the specific exams that you need to sit. So I'll pause here for a second, and I see there are some questions coming in, and why don't I try to answer them? There's one, do they need to follow the ranking of the reserve list? Well, the question supposes there's a ranking in the reserve list. Typically, there's no ranking anymore. Now, I say that with a bit of caution, because maybe for larger competitions, like the upcoming 85, the administrator on grade 5 level that is coming up on the 9th of November, that's going to be a large competition, and there might be ranking in the reserve list. For competitions like this one, with a relatively limited number of places on the reserve list, typically they do not do any ranking. So those 20, 15, 25, 30 individuals who get on the reserve list, there's not going to be a rank of who performed best or second best and so on. It's going to be one unified reserve list for that linguistic profile, and that's it. So any head of unit at the court who wants to hire a person from that reserve list, they're going to look at the list, they will have access to the database, look at the different profiles and backgrounds and every piece of information that you disclosed, that you inserted into your application, and make their pick. So there's no ranking. Number 3, or number 2, but it's number 3 in my list. Those who are not picked from the reserve list, will that list be open to other institutions? So as I said, legally speaking, all of those individuals can be hired by any institution because they passed a competition. Now, again, in the name of loyal cooperation, or in the name of a good working together or between the different institutions, the court may not want other institutions to hire from that reserve list, even if they have not hired all the individuals from that list. And I say that because people might come and go. There might be a need in 6 months, if not immediately, to hire certain individuals. So there is let's say, certain interest not to fully open up that list for other institutions to hire lawyer linguists from that particular list. But again, legally speaking, it's possible. So if you don't get hired for a while, meaning a couple of months, you might want to ask around. You might want to look for opportunities in other institutions. But again, it can be tricky to convince an HR department or another institution saying, hey, I'm on that reserve list. Can you hire me from there? And they will say, well, we take our hands off because that's the court that should manage. So again, it can get more political in that sense as to how the institutions may view that. So perhaps I'll leave it at that. But if you're ever in that situation, maybe reach out to us and we'll see what other piece of advice we might be able to give. And there's one more, and then I go on. So I have a question: supporting documents when there's a requirement of work experience. Do you provide evidence to the minimum required experience, but not more? Or is that the eliminatory element? I won't go too much into this question because there's no work experience required, except for one special scenario, depending on your diploma. We're going to come to that. But it's a very interesting piece here that there's no work experience required, despite the fact that this is an 87 competition. So I'll tell you why that is actually a very interesting thing. But let's go in the normal sequence of the slides. So a few words about eligibility. There are general requirements. 3 general requirements. This is typically the same for every EPSO competition. One is that you need to have EU citizenship. So one of the 27 EU member states need to show on your passport. You need to have fulfilled military service requirements, which is only compulsory in a handful of European countries. And in others, this is not even a thing. So you need to have fulfilled it, or you need to prove that you've been exempted if that is the case. And then you need to meet the character requirements. And that, as I'm told, this actually reflects on security clearance. If you are required to get that security clearance, maybe you're going to be handling highly confidential documents because maybe it's a competition law case and confidentiality is of utmost importance, even more than what is expected of EU officials by default, because there are billions of euros at stake in that particular case. You need to have that clearance. And then it turns out that there is something in your past that may lead to the refusal of that clearance. So again, it's a broad requirement, and it's usually not even checked at the moment as part of the selection procedure, but it might be an issue at the moment of recruitment if and when such clearances or such certificates are required. More importantly, specific requirements, you need to know a lot of languages. You need to know at least 3 EU languages. And the level at which you need to know these languages differs, but it's a linguistic job, aside from being a lawyer job. So the linguistic element requires you to speak or have a sufficient level of knowledge in at least 3 EU languages, which in practice might mean 2 languages, because your mother tongue, provided it's an EU official language, is 1. So that's something that you speak by default. And then the 2 extra foreign languages, so to say, are the formal requirements. It certainly doesn't hurt if you happen to speak or at least understand more languages. It definitely adds to your profile and it increases the chances of you being hired, but it does not count towards your scores in the selection procedure. So it's the 3 languages that they look at. And again, if you have more, make sure you mention that in your application or in the profile, but that would help you only after the reserve list has been drawn up, not necessarily as part of the selection procedure. And then qualifications and work experience, and probably I should put a little asterisk because work experience, as I said before, is not required except for one scenario. So let's look at the languages first and then the rest. So the language rules, language 1, you need to have basically a perfect knowledge of a given language. So that again is the mother tongue or equivalent. So that has to be from one of the languages that this particular competition has among its options. So that's Spanish, Lithuanian, Dutch, Portuguese, Slovak, or English. And as I said before, this is not immediately connected to the language of your citizenship. So that's a separate story. In most cases, the two would overlap, certainly. But then again, formally speaking, it's not assumed that just because you are Dutch, your main language will be Dutch, because maybe you have a Dutch passport, but you grew up in Portugal, then you are free to choose Portuguese. Language 2 must be French. So that's an interesting part, because the official language of the court is French. And that is why in most cases, the judgments, the rulings, the Advocate General's opinion, and all the rest will be in French. So the source language in the vast majority of cases in your future work will be French. So that is the language from which you need to translate into your language 1. And then you have language 3, which can be any of the other 24, well, not other 24, but the other languages from the 24 official EU languages. So let's say you've picked as language 1 Slovak, and language 2 is French, then language 3 has to be what's left. So you are left with 22 other options, and that can be any other, because that is, again, a helpful source language from which you can translate into your language 1. I see from the corner of my eyes, do we need to provide certificate of the level of knowledge of languages? The answer is no. So the exam itself is where you actually prove your level of knowledge of a given language. It is not checked or proven through certificates. So whether you have a DELE exam for Spanish or for English, a TOEFL or Cambridge or any other certificate, it doesn't matter for the purposes of this competition. It's through the particular exams where they will check the level at which you speak or write in a given language. And again, as I said, so it has to be 3 different languages. Qualifications. So let's look at the formal qualifications. And what do you need? Well, you need a degree in law, right? Like that's pretty clear. And that has to be diploma in law as specified for each language profile, right? So that has to be a legal degree. If you obtain that outside of the EU, chances are you would need to get a certain equivalence or certain certificate. But then again, a language can be a tricky thing. So the language and the degree, they have to overlap. And the point I mentioned earlier, there's no professional experience required, which is a very, very interesting case. Why? Because this competition is at 87 level. The rule of thumb in the institutions is that each grade, starting from 85, which is the entry level, requires 3 years of work experience. So 86 would require 3 years of work experience. 87 would require 6 years of work experience inside or outside the institutions, for the institutions to be able to hire you. And this one is a particular notable exception. So 87 would normally require you to have 6 years of work experience, and they require none. So this is actually an amazing opportunity to start at a relatively high administrative grade, and by extension, at a higher salary inside the institutions, despite not having any work experience. Having said that, the work experience is required if your degree was a three-year degree only, right? So if you did a bachelor's degree, then they require 1 year, at least 1 year of relevant work experience. But if you did a full master's course or degree in law, no work experience is required. So this is a really good jumpstart of your EU career at this level. And again, as a side note, a bit of speculation there, but as a side note, as it often happens, it's not always easy for the institutions to hire lawyer linguists for a specific language profile. So that is an incentive for many candidates to say, okay, I'm going to go into this job because it's at a higher level, higher grade than what other opportunities might present. So with that, the professional experience, if it is required, these are the areas which would be considered relevant: legal translation, legal experience as a self-employed lawyer or in a law firm or business or public administration, and a couple of other variations there. So it's not just the translation experience that they would value, but the legal experience that you obtained in one setting or another. Why is it a great opportunity? Certainly, there are lots of benefits. So aside from dealing with legal texts and learning a lot about EU law and learning a lot about how European court judgments are formulated and presented and the substance of these judgments, but there are good benefits for health insurance. There are European schools if you have children, that they are entitled to go there. And the salaries are pretty attractive. Not only because it's an EU job, but again, the fact that it's an 87 level gives you a pretty attractive salary, depending on which part of Europe you are coming from or sitting at right now, no matter, because the number is a pretty attractive one. So we did this calculation we have on our website on EU training, a salary calculator, which you can configure based on your personal situation. You can put the grade, you can put salary step, you can check with kids and where you were hired from. And then in this particular setup, it's 8,600 euros net per month. So that, by all measures, is a pretty good salary. What are the competition phases? Well, let's walk through the different phases. So there's the application process. Nothing truly shocking there, nothing truly surprising there. One thing that I would point out is the application that you fill out on EPSO's website. It's preferred that you do that in the language one, so the language of the exam profile that you will choose. So theoretically, you could do that in any of the 24 official languages, but the idea is that, well, do that in language one for practical reasons, because those who will look at your profile in the very end, beyond the reserve list, already at the recruitment stage, will be from that linguistic unit. So those who are reading it will be speaking the same language, literally speaking. Application deadline, 17th of October, so broadly in a month, with the caveat that if you watch this recording, it's less than a month, but be sure not to leave the application to the last moment. And then the supporting documents, you need to upload that directly into your account. But as I said before, the deadline has been pushed back a little bit. So that's the 14th of December. You see, so they do give more time for you to apply or to send in the supporting documents, and not necessarily immediately. And again, I see here among the questions that what if my law MA graduation is in spring 2024? Well, I think it depends on what current degree you already have. Presumably you have a bachelor already. And then if you can prove you have 1 year of relevant work experience, you already qualify. But if you don't have the MA right now, which seems to be the case based on your question, then you absolutely need that 1 year experience. If you had it, you would not need that extra 1 year of experience. But going back to the presentation, supporting documents can be uploaded later. All good, gives you enough time to get hold of whatever you may not have already in your possession. What are the tests? Well, the tests are very straightforward. There is a computer-based part in language one. So that is where you have the classic abstract, verbal, and numerical reasoning tests. And then you have translation test, right? We would abbreviate that as TT, but that again, that's our internal lingo. Translation test in language 1, 2, and 3. How does that all come together? Basically, you do 2 translation tests, not 3, but 2, and we'll see what the language combinations are. Very importantly, all tests, basically the computer-based tests, so the abstract, verbal, numerical reasoning, and the 2 translation tests happen on a single day. On the same day, remotely proctored, so you can be sitting anywhere in the world on a computer in basically one sitting. Certainly there is time for a bathroom break and stuff, but it's in one go. Another technical note, but very important, is be sure that you have a computer where you have administrator rights. So if it's a corporate computer, you may not be allowed to install the software that EPSO, or rather the partner that runs these tests, require. So be sure that you have the right device, but they communicate all of that information to you in advance, and already it's widely available of what technical configuration you would need. Computer-based tests, it's in language 1. So that's the kind of the main language of your competition, language 1. Importantly, it's a pass or fail. It's pass or fail, and it doesn't count towards the final score. So it's an eliminatory test. It's not actually testing your abilities of how good of a translator or lawyer linguist or reviewer you would be. But this is really, it's a selection test in the sense that it's a pass-fail. You need to get through that. It's a hurdle you need to jump over. And once you do it, that's when the more substantive exam, the 2 translations, come. Verbal reasoning, numerical abstract reasoning, what do they look like? Well, there's a lot of information out there about it. On our website, we have ebooks, we have webinars, we have methodology, articles, resources, really a wealth of information out there. Some are free, some are paid. We also have our trainers and coaches in group sessions and individual coaching. So if you feel the need that you need to improve on those to increase your chances, then absolutely get in touch or look at the website, and we're going to point you to the right resources to help you really practice these exams. Verbal reasoning, 20 questions in 35 minutes. Generally, that tends to be the easiest, and especially those who are more comfortable with words, and lawyers and legally minded candidates tend to be the case. Where challenges often come up is either the numerical reasoning, which requires data interpretation, reasoning, estimation, and especially under time pressure, or abstract reasoning. So abstract reasoning is where the greatest pressure is, because you have 10 questions in 10 minutes. So that tends to put the greatest pressure on most candidates. And as I said, this is a pass-fail requirement. There's no ranking. There's no cutoff point for the top X% of candidates. And the pass-fail is calculated overall. So you can get 40 points for the verbal, numerical, and abstract combined, and then you need to obtain 20 points out of 40. So the combined pass mark is 50%, which essentially means that if you get verbal reasoning perfectly right and you completely fail numerical and abstract reasoning, you can still pass. So you can have 20 points and not necessarily need 21, 30, 35. Obviously, you don't want to risk it. You want to do your best, and you want to be sure that you don't fail in this particular step. But the threshold is relatively low, especially if I consider other competitions where they might do a different combination of the scoring, or they might raise the bar even above 50%. So this is pretty doable. And only those who pass this particular step, so only those who reach at least 20 points out of 40 will have their translation test scored. An important thing, you still need to sit that, right? Like when you're sitting the test in the setting, they're not going to give you immediately the answer. They're not going to say, hey, you didn't pass 50%, don't even bother going on with the translation. Or at least this is the case right now. I need to be cautious because this new system is still somewhat being fine-tuned. So who knows? You might be confronted with that when they immediately check that you passed or did not pass that particular exam, though I think they're not going to complicate the IT and the procedural side of things. Chances are you need to sit the translation test without knowing whether or not you passed the computer-based test beforehand. Translation test, there are 2 translations that you are required to do without a dictionary. right? So you cannot have an electronic or a paper dictionary in the room, on the screen, or elsewhere. And it's a translation test where you have a legal text in language 2, so basically in French, and then you need to turn that into your language 1. And then you need to do almost the same thing, but the source language is language 3, and then you need to turn that into language 1. So again, just to share my own personal example, back at the time, I had the same, so from French into Hungarian, and then I think I chose Spanish into Hungarian. Well, I couldn't have chosen anything else because I don't speak any other language on that level. So French was the source language, and then it was Spanish, but the target was always language 1. And it's the same thing here. The scoring is in a range of 0 to 80, and then the pass mark is at 40. And only those who reach the pass mark for language 1 will have their language 2 scored. Now, the overall score, based on this, 160, and there's certainly a ranking. So there, the competitive element comes in when they will rank you on the basis of your translation quality and results. And you might ask, okay, what are the criteria that they consider? Now, I took the liberty to create a simple scoring grid, and all the legal disclaimers and caveats apply. So this is by no means the official version or the scoring grid that the selection board members are going to use, but it gives you a rough idea on what aspects and what sort of things the assessors, or I use the term assessors, but selection board members actually use to be able to give you a realistic score. Certainly, they're not going to just read a translation and say, this is pretty good, let's give it 48 points. Or they say, well, this is not so good, 32. So there needs to be a structured method, because if ever you challenge it, they need to be able to prove that they used a system and that they used an unbiased and uniformly applicable system. As a side note, challenging, let's say, a scoring, which is still somewhat subjective, but the way it happens is there are typically two persons who independently of each other will score your translation, and then they take the average point that they gave. So, and then if you afterwards still want to challenge that, that can be difficult and usually would not succeed. Exactly for that reason, because they use a structured method, two persons independently of each other would score that, and they say, well, that's how it is. Unless there is some procedural error, or they say, well, they knew who I was, and then they discriminated against me for any reason. As long as you can prove it, then you might have a case. Going back to this one, this is also on our website, so we just put it out there, courtesy of Rita, who worked very hard on that. So a big thanks to her, which is this embedded grid that you can browse around. You can get a better idea of the kind of criteria that are out there. You have like accuracy, how much you understood the actual text and how much you could bring it back to life in your language 1. And then the formatting, the presentation, the linguistic sophistication, and other stuff like that. So hopefully it gives you an idea if you want to practice that, or practice with a friend, and then you cross-check each other's translations, then this might be a helpful way to do that. Eligibility check only comes at this point, as we had said earlier. So once they have established a short list of candidates who passed the computer-based tests, the CBT, and have obtained the sufficient scores for the translation, they say, okay, it's probably a larger list than the number of places on the reserve list, because they do the eligibility check with the understanding that some candidates may not be proven to be eligible because their documents, their background papers may not meet the requirements. So what are declarations? What declarations have you made, and what do the documents show? And as I said earlier, this is what happens at this stage. And if everything goes well, then they do a ranking. And then on that basis, they create the reserve list. So to emphasize the earlier point, one of you asked at the beginning, what about the ranking on the reserve list? No, the ranking happens based on the scores, but then whoever is above that cutoff score will be on the reserve list without any ranking. And then with that caveat that they might take a different approach and still do a ranking based on the new system, but then again, based on the many years of our experience, and we've been observing this process, they probably won't do that. From your perspective, it doesn't have such a big practical implication. As long as you're on the reserve list, you are eligible to be hired. So then you can even do some proactive lobbying if you know some heads of unit in the relevant linguistic units and say, hey, I'm on the reserve list and I'm eager to be hired, so please consider me. You are notified, you open a champagne, or at least you put that in the fridge and you wait until you're actually hired, which hopefully would happen soon enough. Then you can open your champagne. So this, as I said before, might involve another conversation or interview, but given the nature of this particular competition and the relatively limited number of laureates, successful candidates, they might not subject you to very stringent additional interviews. So how to get the job? But before I get there, a couple of questions as we're nearing the end of our time and the presentation. What if my law that I've already seen? What are the chances for a certain language that the required people on the reserve list is not reached after the selection process? Well, given the relatively low numbers of places on this particular reserve list, I think that would be reached. But then again, who knows? Maybe for Lithuanian, there won't be as many eligible candidates who passed all these different steps. It's more of a pragmatic or practical concern for that given linguistic unit, but it doesn't impact the overall process. So there they might say, okay, well, we don't have enough people. Is everybody really great on that list? And we're going to hire everyone as fast as we can, depending on the vacancies as well. Or they might say, well, we want to have a couple of temporary agents to fill in certain vacancies. As someone who passed the Lawyer-Linguists competition, how would you recommend preparing for the translation test in a couple of months? Well, I give you my story, and hopefully that brings some lessons. Whether by design or by chance, but a couple months before I had set this particular competition back then, I landed a part-time job or moonlighting job, to use that nice expression, of working for a translation office and doing legal translations to earn some extra money. So that was actually the best preparation for this particular competition, because I was doing legal translations exactly the way I would do at the competition or later on. So again, you can do that if you are interested in this kind of thing, or find a translation bureau, and you can even offer to work at maybe below market prices, because you have the secondary goal of improving your translation and linguistic abilities. So that would be a win-win. And if not that, you can just simply do translations and have it cross-checked with some friends, or perhaps even with ChatGPT. Who knows whether it can evaluate a translation to that degree. So it's practice, really. I mean, you're not going to just sit down and learn a legal dictionary and certain terms. So it needs to require practice. And honestly, translation is certainly not limited to your vocabulary. As anyone who's interested in this would know, it's really about your ability to formulate sentences and convert a text into your target language in a way that does not feel that it's a translation to the reader. I think that's the number one goal, is that when somebody reads that, they're not going to have that impression that, ooh, this was written in another language and it was translated, because the sentence structure and the overall style just doesn't sound very natural. All right, for English language Lawyer-Linguists competition, the notice of competition indicates it's required to hold a degree in law or its equivalent awarded in the Republic of Ireland, or a qualification as a barrister solicitor. All right, I'd rather take this question later. Maybe we'll follow up, maybe we'll write a short memo or a short note with all these questions, because I don't want to say something that may not be accurate. And the question seems to be a little more complex than what I can immediately address right now. So let me just finish this off, and one or two other questions we might have time for. And I have a special discount code. I didn't give you that sales pitch. But yes, we have a special discount code for all of you who are courageous enough to stay with us until the very end, which is about 4 more minutes. But that's something you can take advantage of. What are our general pieces of advice for this? Well, practice the CBT test, practice translations, and have a good understanding of what is expected of you and how that is evaluated. Now, whether that's 1 hour per day or 3 hours twice a week, entirely up to you. But take it seriously, because it is a competition, and certainly there are many other candidates. It's open for really a large number of candidates across Europe. So be sure that you take it seriously and really dedicate some targeted preparation time for it. Learn methodology, especially for the CBT, so the computer-based tests, because you can be much more efficient and much more accurate if you know what exactly you need to pay attention to. And just a little side note, we're actually releasing very soon a couple of video explanations, as we call it, for numerical reasoning and abstract reasoning. So it walks you through step by step how you come to a solution for a given test. So it's not just a short explanation of why a correct answer is the correct answer, but it's a step-by-step narrated explanation, which is also to help candidates understand the methodology. And then staying persistent. So not just rush ahead, but a bit like a sports competition preparation. You want to have a plan. You want to know your timeline and have a structured, process-driven preparation and doing simulations, as we said before. So we're here to help. All the resources, practice tests. We're proud to say we have all 24 languages covered for verbal reasoning. So you can practice in Slovak, you can practice in Lithuanian, you can practice in Portuguese, in all the languages that are covered by the competition. We have verbal reasoning tests in those languages. And then the webinars I mentioned, some are free, some are paid. And then other resources like tips and tricks and many other resources. And again, if you have any questions, something we can help you with, or the question that I didn't have time to answer, and I know number 11, please, well, I promise I'll get back to you soon enough, but it's just pretty long and we're nearing the end of our time, but I'll try to look at it maybe right after the webinar or at least in a couple of hours and follow up. And then with other resources like the test book, you might know, and Facebook groups and other communities, and then the special discount offer that I briefly mentioned. So let me just take 1 or 2 other questions here. This one I think I addressed. Do you have a best practice when there is one word, one abbreviation that you cannot translate? So should you mention this or better to guess? Well, if it's in the source language, you need to translate that. And you're probably better off with a guess. And since you asked, just that very personal anecdote where in our translation at the time, I remember until today, there was this expression in English called interlocutory injunction. Very legal expression, right? And I'm not sure I would be able to really explain it briefly, even today, what it actually means. Some of you are probably very well aware of this particular expression. That is to say, so there was that source language expression. And as we spoke with others after the exam, most of the candidates really had no clue what it actually means, least of all in Hungarian. And still, we try to translate that in one way or another based on the context. So based on understanding what it likely means in that setting, and the same goes for any abbreviation or other, is that you want to be able to put something there and not just say, hey, I have no clue what this is, or just simply using the original version abbreviation. So that's broadly it. I know question 11, at least in my numbering, something we'll come back to soon enough. But I'd like to be sure that we stay within the boundaries of the webinar of 1 hour. A big thanks to Rita, to Agi, to everyone who made this webinar possible. So thank you so much. And please send us a message, get in touch with us if we can be helpful in guiding you in this labyrinth of EU competitions, EU exams. And if anything else comes up in the course of your preparation, then we are here for you as a resource and perhaps as a guide to some degree. So with that, thank you so much for your time. As promised, we'll follow up for this question or maybe there are one or two questions that I didn't have time to cover, but the recording will be available, the slides will be available, and the transcript will be available soon enough. And that is something you can come back to and look up everything I've said. And of course, the caveat, we are not the official source of information. We do really our very best to be as accurate as possible, but it's always the notice of competition and the selection board that has the final word on any of these. So if you're unsure, rather reach out to them and they will tell you how a certain rule needs to be interpreted. With that, a big thank you. Have a nice rest of your day. Everything will be sent to your inbox and to be continued, and wishing you lots of luck. So take this seriously and you will succeed. And once you do, let us know. Thank you so much.